Hey everyone, my name's Jason. I'm a community manager at Coffee Stain Studios, and you know what? Game developers use a lot of tools when they're making games, and probably more than you even realized. And so I thought it might be interesting to show you all every tool that we use to make Satisfactory. I say every tool, it's more like most tools. There's probably some that's been missed, but this is a pretty comprehensive list. And by tools, I specifically mean individual pieces of software. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of like plugins, and I'm not really going to cover hardware either. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to group up the tools by discipline, and which means that I may be repeating some tools, and that's because different disciplines use the same tools but for different reasons and in different ways, and I thought it might be interesting to highlight that. And there'll be like a timeline here so you can skip to any specific discipline if you want to find out what do the programs use, what do 3D artists use, or you can just sit and watch the whole thing, up to you, but it's going to be a long one. So this is going to be a big old list, so I'm just going to keep things quite brief. I'm just going to talk about what tools we use, what they do, how we use them, and then, and show you some satisfactory stuff inside those tools as well, which might be interesting to get some behind the scenes looks at some things. So hopefully this is going to be interesting or exciting for you, whether or not you're a Satisfactory fan to see the behind the scenes stuff, or if you're an aspiring game developer or an actual game developer, you're just curious about what we're using, or maybe it's like 2 a.m. and YouTube recommended this to you for some reason and you're just here. And if that's the case, that's fine too. Hello, my name is Jason. I'm a community manager at Coffee Stain Studios. We work on an open world factory building and exploration game called Satisfactory. If after watching this video you're interested in checking the game out, there'll be links in the description below for where you can find it. All right, let's do this. Vamonos! So before we get into discipline-specific stuff, before we get into the meat and potatoes, let's just do some general tools that everyone is using every day, pretty much. So the first tool that I'm going to mention is, of course, going to be Unreal Engine 4. We use Unreal Engine 4 to make Satisfactory. So if you don't really know what a game engine actually is, it's just essentially a suite of tools that provide you, tools in order to like render stuff or play audio or do animations, programming. Just that's essentially what it is. And so engines don't necessarily have to have fancy UI or anything to them, but Unreal Engine is actually just kind of like a general purpose tool that can be used to make many different kinds of games or applications. And so it has like a nice interface and a lot of extra tools in it as well. The next tool that everybody uses is Google search, of course. So like, we're always learning. We sometimes run into problems we can't figure out, and we need to Google things to find maybe documentation or message boards where other people have like helped others solve certain problems. So Google is a huge part for pretty much everyone across the all disciplines in game development. Yeah, if there's something you don't know, ask Google Sensei. Next up is Perforce. Perforce is a version control software, and basically that just means everyone can submit their work and their changes to the game to the Perforce server, and that keeps track of all the submissions that everyone has made and can help with like merging any sort of conflicts or anything like that as well. So that way everyone can just, get their latest files from the server so they can be working with everyone's latest work, or even roll back to previous versions if we need to. Unreal Game Sync is just a tool that ties in with the Perforce server and just provides like a nice interface for syncing Unreal Engine 4 projects. We use Microsoft 365 internally at Coffee Stain to varying degrees of reluctance, but we do. Okay, so like that means just the entire suite of Microsoft products, that do various different things. So for example, like SharePoint for our intranet, we use OneDrive for file sharing and storage, we use Outlook, Inbox, and Calendar for scheduling events and emails, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, all that kind of stuff. Teams for chatting and file sharing as well. And we also use forums to collect information internally or externally. And as for the Microsoft Office stuff like Word and Excel and all that, we'll talk more about those specifically later in each discipline because different disciplines use those for different reasons. And yeah, we'll cover that a little later. We use Monday.com, which is essentially just a task management tool or planning tool. And everyone just uses Monday.com to keep track of the tasks that they have assigned to them. WireGuard is a VPN software, and so we use WireGuard to set up VPNs and to allow us to connect to our internal network at the office from home, which has been obviously very useful for us during the pandemic. And lastly, we use Steam, Epic, and Humble. These are just basically where we distribute and market our games, but Steam and Epic also provide a bunch of tools that we use for certain tools and services for like networking and things like that to get the game running. Okay, so moving on to our first actual discipline of people, we're going to be talking about the programmers, or I like to call them the pro gamers. So our programmers obviously use Unreal Engine 4. They're programming in C++ native code, or also in Blueprints as well, which is a visual scripting language kind of built into Unreal Engine. And so some people sometimes ask us, do your programs use C++ or Blueprint? For the most part, they prefer native, so C++ programming. That's generally where most of the programming work gets done. However, Blueprint is like an integral part of the way Unreal Engine works, and it's also a very useful tool for our UI artists and designers. And so our programmers do need to bridge the gap between native and blueprints sometimes, and do have to do some things in blueprints. Sometimes it just makes sense to do things in blueprints. You know, just got to use the right tool for the right job. And of course, they use Unreal Engine for testing the game and debugging the game as well. Our programmers also use Visual Studio and Writer. These are two different softwares, but they're both IDEs, which stands for Integrated Development Environments. Essentially, they're just tools that allow our programmers to write code, build the code, debug it, and run it. Also, a handy tool that they use is they can attach their editor to the Unreal Engine sort of editor while they're testing, so they can like stop the game at any point, at any line of code, and like figure out what's going on. Just use that as a tool to help with debugging or problem solving. So I say we use Visual Studio and Writer. It's more that some people like to use Visual Studio and some people prefer to use Writer. We have had a few of our programmers move to Writer recently. They sort of feel that it's sort of more geared a little bit more towards game development, or specifically Unreal Engine 4. But essentially, these are both great tools, and it's a matter of preference, and people are just using what they want. Yeah, so we kind of just use both. Another tool our programmers use is called Beyond Compare. And Beyond Compare is a tool for diffing and merging. And what that means is that when, for example, when a programmer wants to submit their code to the Perforce server, they need to diff and merge their files to make sure that there's no conflict. So sometimes different people will be editing the same file, and so when you try to merge those together, you need to figure out what are the differences. That's the diffing, and then how to merge the code together so that it actually all still works, and that's the merging part. So Beyond Compare is a tool that assists with that. Perforce actually has one of these tools already built in, but many of our programmers prefer to use Beyond Compare. They think it has a few extra features, and yeah, they just prefer that. Some of us still use the Perforce diff tools as well. And lastly, our programmers also use Notepad or Notepad++. They're just basic lightweight text editors. You all probably have experience with Notepad. Notepad++ is also a lightweight text editor, but has some extra features in it as well that and is kind of geared towards programming things like syntax highlighting and stuff like that as well. And our programs just use that to like read log files or edit config files, just really sort of basic stuff. The next discipline we're going to look at are our 3D artists. Probably the most important tool for our 3D artists that they use is called Blender. Blender is a 3D modeling and animation software, but it can do much more than just 3D modeling and animation. And we use it for game-ready, low-poly 3D models, and we also use it for like UV texture unwrapping and stuff like that. UVs are essentially just kind of like how you unwrap your 3D models into a flat surface so that you can paint textures over them. And we use Blender mostly for inorganic objects, so for example, factory buildings in Satisfactory. Another tool that they use is Substance Designer. Substance Designer is kind of this like node-based procedural texture creation tool kind of thing, and basically we just kind of use that to generate or create textures from scratch that we then use in the game. And oftentimes those textures go over to our next tool, which is Substance Painter. Substance Painter allows our 3D artists to apply textures or materials to models to create texture maps that they can then use later in the game, and it also has the ability for our artists to actually literally hand paint textures on to the model directly if they wanted to. Next up is Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop. Everyone here kind of knows what Photoshop is. It's like an image editing, photo editing, or drawing application with a lot of really handy tools for it. Basically just, 2D raster images. And actually many people at the office use Photoshop, and our 3D artists use Photoshop specifically for just checking textures or maybe even doing some tweaking to the textures directly, because minor changes to textures can be done a lot quicker in Photoshop rather than like Substance Painter or Designer. And we also use Photoshop to create foliage textures, so like leaves and things like that. So those, we don't really generate those procedurally in Substance Designer. We would just take like actual pictures of leaves. So we use Photoshop to make, foliage textures out of that. Next tool is Marmoset Toolbag 3. Marmoset is a software that predominantly is used for real-time rendering, but it can do some other things as well. And so we use Marmoset essentially for baking. And what that means is we take a high poly model and we would bake certain details of it into texture maps, like the normals or the ambient occlusion and things like that. And so what we can do is we can capture details from a high poly mesh and then put it on a low poly mesh and give the low poly mesh the appearance that it looks, the appearance that it has details that it actually doesn't, right? And so this is a pretty common technique to make low poly meshes look better than they actually are, essentially. Another tool that we have used in the past, I don't know if we use it too much anymore, it's called Xnormal, and this is another, texture baking software. Another tool our 3D artists use is ZBrush. ZBrush is like a 3D high poly sculpting tool. So different sort of workflow to how things work in Blender, but we use it for the most part for more high poly things. We mainly use it for more organic things as well. So think like rocks or alien plants or creatures or even the pioneer themselves, the main character that you play as. And then we use some of these high poly versions to to bake them in Marmoset. Another software that we don't actually use anymore, but we did use for a long time is Autodesk Maya. Maya is also a 3D modeling and animation tool. So we don't really use Maya anymore for 3D modeling. We pretty much do all our modeling in Blender now. There might be a few models here and there that, we still have them in Maya files, but for the most part, everything is being done in Blender now. The last tool that our 3D artists use is called PureRef. It's a free reference board tool, and what that basically means is it's just a place where you can just drag and drop images to create a board of reference material or inspiration. Pretty much all artists use references whenever they're creating any kind of thing. And so having a tool to manage their reference boards and to easily create reference boards is pretty important as well. And PureRef is what our 3D artists use for that. So for the next group, we're talking about our 2D artists. So the first tool is like a bit of a no-brainer. It's going to be Adobe Photoshop. So this is where our 2D artists do a lot of their work, and they use it to create their final production-ready concept art, and also for any sort of like marketing material that we need as well. Our 2D artists also use Procreate, which is an iPad-only drawing software, and so they use that for, quick, rough concepting and scribbles and sketches and stuff like that. So I think a lot of their ideas might start there. And so then the last tool that our 2D artists use is actually Unreal Engine 4. They also use the engine as well. They jump in there. They use the engine to essentially block things out, to block out scenes or assess scale between different items or buildings before they, go in and start creating any sort of like concept art that they might need to be doing. The next discipline is going to be UI, UI standing for user interface, but our UI artists also do UX, which is user experience. So we consider them UI/UX beings. UI UX humans. So our UI artists use Adobe Illustrator, actually, which is something we haven't mentioned yet. So a lot of people know what Photoshop is, but not as many people probably know what Illustrator is. And they're kind of the same thing. They're both like image creation or editing software. However, Photoshop focuses on raster images, which is images with pixel data, like colors and stuff in it. Think about PNGs or JPEGs. Whereas Illustrator focuses on vector images. And what vector images are images that are created out of like shapes and lines and curves and things like that. And so essentially those files contain mathematical formulas that recreate the images, which then render to your screen, which is pretty fancy. And basically the main benefit of this is that you can scale things up and down, for example, and they never lose quality. That's one of the biggest advantages of vector art. And this can be beneficial if you're thinking about like print, for example, if you want a logo on a business card, or if you want the logo on a billboard. If it's made in vector art, you don't have to make two different versions. You can just scale it up or down. This is also useful in game dev when you don't really know how big your UI elements need to be. Maybe they need to be resized and be repurposed in other ways. Maybe if your game ends up getting like a mobile companion app and you want to use the same UI elements, you can scale them down. You don't have to recreate new ones. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits in starting in Adobe Illustrator for UI elements. And we use Illustrator to make all of our UI elements. Our UI artists also use Adobe Photoshop as well, because at the end of the day, we will take those UI elements made in Illustrator, those vector images, and we will need to convert them into raster images, into PNGs, which we can then import into the engine. So we use Photoshop to, basically export them into PNGs, or maybe touch them up a little bit if they need a little bit of love or a little bit of tweaking. Our UI artists also use Unreal Engine 4, and this is because they not only just design and draw the UI elements, but they also do some of the programming for it as well. So they need to use blueprints to script the UI elements to work the way that they want. They use a thing called UMG, which is basically the UI tool, I guess you could call it, in Unreal Engine 4, like a layout tool and things like that. So they use UMG to set up their UI elements. And they also work with some shaders, which are basically small scripts or programs that run kind of on the graphics card. And they use that to manipulate certain UI elements to do certain things. One example is, for example, the fluid animation on the, on pipes, for example. There's actually no animation on the artwork of that. There's no waves or anything like that. That's all created using shaders. Our UI and UX people also use Microsoft Visio and YEd. These are both like flowchart and diagramming tools. We, for the most part, pretty much use YEd now. It seems like we used to use Visio, but we don't really use it anymore. And we use it to create like the menu flow, like, how menus should work what should happen when you click on buttons, etc., etc. This is more of like the UX side of things, user experience. And we weren't going to talk about hardware, but notebooks. Apparently we need to put notebooks on this list. They use a lot of notebooks. Just kind of need to. F for the trees. The next discipline that I'm going to talk about is animation. And I actually only have one piece of software here, one tool to tell you guys about really, and that is Autodesk Maya. So I talked about Maya before with our 3D artists because we used to make our 3D models in Maya. We don't do that anymore, but we do still animate in Maya. So we use Maya for animation and also like rigging models so that they can be animated. So we weren't really going to talk about plugins, but you know, there aren't too many tools under the animation section anyway. So, and I was told by Max, our animator, that Animbot is a worthy mention here. It's something that he, you know, really relies on, and it's essentially just a plugin that gives a bunch of extra tools that makes animating in Maya much easier. And he thinks that it's a great idea that if you're an animator and you haven't heard of Animbot, that maybe you should check out Animbot. So we're just going to mention that here. Next up is VFX, so visual effects. So think of like explosions or little particle effects on the screen or anything like that. And so the first tool that our VFX artist uses is called Houdini. Houdini is kind of like an all-in-one 3D software, but it's like most well known for its simulations. So think about like destruction or fire or fluids and physics, etc. It is a node-driven and parametric software, so you can basically connect nodes so that you can create behaviors that you want. You can tweak them with parameters as you go. And so our VFX artist uses Houdini to create dynamic simulations, which you can then convert into frames of animation, and then he can take those frames, convert them into like a flipbook kind of thing, and then use those as images on particles in the game, animated images essentially. The next tool that our VFX artist uses is Blender. We've mentioned Blender before, and basically he uses Blender for prototyping materials quickly before implementing them in Unreal Engine 4, or he also uses Blender to create 3D meshes that he might need to use for various VFX purposes. Our VFX artist, of course, also uses Unreal Engine, and yeah, so our VFX artist uses this for, you know, creating materials in Unreal Engine, but also uses the Niagara particle system. We used to use Cascade, which was the old one, but Niagara is now production ready, so we switched to Niagara. They also use Substance Designer, another one that we mentioned earlier, and he would use Substance Designer to create textures, but specifically kind of like noise textures, which can be useful for various reasons in VFX. And lastly, he also uses Adobe Photoshop, and this is also for just tweaking textures or noise maps and things like that. Next discipline that we're going to talk about is tech art. Now, tech art, this is where the real big brain shit happens. I mean, everyone is very good at what they do, but the tech art is some, I hope I can do it justice. This is some big brain voodoo magic shit. So like, if I get anything wrong, I'm sorry. I'm just doing my best. Be kind to me in the comments, please. Our tech artist uses Visual Studio Code and Rider. These are both IDEs I mentioned before. Rider was an IDE. Visual Studio Code is one as well. And these are used for programming, of course. And so our tech artist uses Visual Studio Code when coding like tools and stuff like that. But when he has to do anything regarding Unreal Engine 4, he tends to use Rider. Our tech artist also uses Houdini. However, he uses it in a much different way than what you would sort of expect. Most of his work is actually done on the command line, so he doesn't really open up Houdini. He just executes the tools that Houdini has from command line using other scripts and whatever, right? I don't know, it's some crazy shit. So he uses Houdini and the scripting languages that it supports, Python, HScript, and Vex. And he basically uses Houdini as a tool to batch process geometry. And what this sort of means is, for example, it's like mass applying data to leaves on trees, for example, that indicate how they should behave in the wind shader, so how they should sway in the wind. This could be for generating meshes, or another use is converting raw animation data into vertex animation data. This is for optimization purposes, so that we can hopefully get better optimizations in the distance without any sort of extra overhead. I'm not gonna pretend to understand all this stuff 100%. It vaguely makes sense to me, but I don't feel super comfortable explaining it all. Anyway, he does a lot of crazy stuff with Houdini. He just does a lot of crazy stuff in general, quite frankly. Tech art is voodoo. The next tool that our tech artist uses is Python. Python is a scripting language, and of course, as I mentioned just before with Houdini, it can be used with Houdini. But he also uses Python to create other just smaller pipeline tools, or like a profiling tool that we use to check the performance of our game. Yeah, so a few different uses for Python. Our tech artist also uses Blender, mostly to check the other 3D artists' work to see if there's any sort of optimizations he can do with the meshes, to see if he can save some, you know, data without compromising the visual quality. He will also use Blender to create these things called imposters. Sus. Here, look. And imposters are just like super, super low poly meshes. that are swapped in place of the more high quality meshes when things are in the distance. So, you know, they're super, super low quality, but they still kind of visually read as what the object is supposed to be when they're really far away. Saves a lot of performance. Our tech artist also uses Adobe Photoshop. Everyone's having a go with Photoshop, honestly, and he uses Photoshop for tweaking textures, or sometimes even for generating textures as well. Our tech artist also uses Substance Designer for exporting textures, or uses the node graph that's available in Substance Designer to script and essentially use it as like a pipeline tool. I've seen some things that he's made where he would use it to, if he's got a bunch of textures that he wants to include in one texture, he could use it to lay out the textures neatly so they don't overlap or anything like that, and he doesn't have to do it manually himself, just to speed up the process. And lastly, our tech artist uses Substance Painter as well, and this is just for texture editing, basically. Next discipline is going to be sound design. So the first tool that our sound designer uses is called Wise, and Wise is kind of like a middleware. It's an industry standard audio engine that we use to hook into Unreal Engine 4, and we use that to store and control all game audio. Unreal Engine 4 does actually have an audio engine built into it, but we just use Wise instead. And yeah, so basically the way it sort of works is we set up a sound's property or behavior in Wise, and then we use Unreal Engine 4 to trigger the sound in Wise. The next tool that our sound designer uses is Reaper, and Reaper is a DAW or DAW, which stands for Digital Audio Workstation. And essentially it's a workstation that gives a bunch of tools to do everything related to audio stuff. This can be from music to sound design. And we mostly use Reaper for post-processing sounds in order for us to create certain sounds that we were looking for. Vital is another software that our sound designer uses. Vital is a wavetable synthesizer, and this is a tool that allows us essentially to manipulate sound waves. So you can start with simpler waves such as like sine waves or saw waves, if you sort of know what those are, and then you can manipulate them in ways that you want in order to generate more complex sounds. And so one example is the particle accelerator from Satisfactory. The sound that it makes was created using Vital. And the last thing I want to mention real quick is hardware, just recording hardware in general. We have a bunch of different recording hardware, but I'm not going to go into detail here. We weren't going to cover it, but it is worth mentioning that, you know, recording hardware and just hardware in general for a sound designer is a pretty big part of their job. Not going to be covering the tools used by our composers, by the way. We don't actually have a composer at Coffee Stain. We do have a couple people that we work with that we contract. But yeah, I'm just kind of covering the tools of the people who work with us at the studio, and we don't actually have any composers at the studio. Not going to be covering music or composition tools, unfortunately. The next discipline is going to be producers. And I know when people think game developers, you think artists and programmers and stuff like that. But you know, producers are a pretty important role when it comes to game development too, and they have a bunch of tools that they use too. Producers do a lot of planning and things like that, and so the Microsoft Office suite is you know, a no-brainer here. So our producers are using Microsoft Word and Excel and PowerPoint, etc., and they use these kind of things for planning, creating timelines, presentations for the team, documentation, to-dos, things like that. And they also use, you know, Microsoft Outlook for emails, as I mentioned before in the general. But, you know, they use it even more so because they do a lot of scheduling, a lot of meetings with different people and things like that. So they're pretty heavy users when it comes to, you know, Outlook and Calendar. Now, even though we use Microsoft products internally at Coffee Stain, we sometimes work with other companies or people externally who don't use Microsoft products. And so our producers actually use the Google Suite or G Suite quite a lot as well. And so that's Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, Google Drive as well, for example, to share files. Yeah, and this is mainly used when communicating or interacting with people outside of Coffee Stain, since yeah, we use Microsoft internally. Our producers also use Slack to communicate, and so internally, again, with Microsoft, we use Teams, but because our producers might be talking to people outside of Coffee Stain, they sometimes need to use Slack in order to do that as well. Now, we mentioned Monday.com. This is a tool that our producers use quite a bit as well. We mentioned Monday.com in the beginning under General, because everyone uses Monday.com, but our producers are the ones who, you know, formulate everything there, create all the scheduling, the timelines. They're creating a bunch of tasks, organizing everything. They're using Monday.com in ways that the rest of us are not using it. So it's definitely worthwhile mentioning here that you know, our producers do use Monday.com to keep track of everything, to plan everything. Next discipline is going to be game design, and the first tool that our game designers use is this is a no-brainer. It's going to be Unreal Engine 4. And basically what our game designers do is they pretty much grab everything else that everyone else has done and they glue it all together in Unreal Engine 4, and most importantly, they then make it fun. So this means like integrating new content, might be setting up new buildings, adding them to build menus, setting up progression, for example, tweaking settings. Yeah, tweaking a bunch of things like, you know, use zoop limits or creature health, alt recipe balancing, I mean, balancing factory numbers in general. They also work in the engine in order to do some small adjustments to the world or for prototyping new features that they want. So they use blueprints to just quickly prototype some stuff that they want to try out. And they also use the engine to add gameplay elements to the world as well. So think about like creature spawners, resource nodes, adding nuts and berries, gas pillars, collectibles, you know, all that kind of stuff. And maybe not a lot of people would be expecting this next one, but our game designers use Excel a lot. They use Excel quite a bit. They use Excel basically to keep track of all the numbers, all the balancing. This means like the number of creatures, where they should go, how many power slugs we have, you know, what kinds we have, where are they, the ratios of all the resources. Yeah, just basically all the information about the world is in like one or more massive sort of Excel spreadsheet. And then they will make changes to the Excel spreadsheet based on metrics and feedback and the planning for what they intend to do in the future. Next up is going to be Microsoft Word. Now, they don't really use Microsoft Word too much anymore beyond just like basic note taking, but we did previously use Microsoft Word for like feature proposals in order to communicate, you know, intended plans to the rest of the team. However, this wasn't really like a very effective way to communicate all the plans. Just having a boring document wasn't really a great way of communicating things to the rest of the team. And so that brings us to our next tool, which is going to be Microsoft PowerPoint. And so our game designers now use PowerPoint to create presentations for the rest of the team in order to communicate features that are planned or proposed. Because conveying ideas to the rest of the team very clearly and in a concise way is very, very important. And yeah, we find PowerPoint to be a much more powerful tool to do this than Microsoft Word was. So now they just do a lot of PowerPoint presentations in there. Our game designers use Photoshop. This is for drawing over the map in order to plan or lay out their future changes, but they also use Photoshop to enhance their presentations, their PowerPoint presentations as well. Our game designers also use MS Paint, actually. Pretty handy tool, very lightweight image editing thing. Y'all probably know what MS Paint is. I don't know why I'm explaining it, but actually, yeah, we use MS Paint as well. It's quick to get up and running. Sometimes you just need to draw over a screenshot to convey an idea, and this happens fairly often, so we figured we would include MS Paint here on the list. Microsoft Visio, which we mentioned before with the UI UX people, is sort of like a, you know, diagram and flowchart kind of tool, and sometimes we would use Microsoft Visio to create some diagrams. We don't really use it too much, but you know, we do use it from time to time. And then another honorable mention here is going to be all the notebooks and whiteboard markers that we have burned through, that our game designers have burned through, you know, furiously note-taking and jotting down their ideas. Next up is going to be the tools used for world design. The big tool here for world design is going to be, of course, Unreal Engine 4. This is where we implement any of our world changes and things like that. So we use the tools in Unreal Engine 4 to shape the terrain. We can use them to paint foliage, and foliage can be, of course, bushes and trees, but it can also be like small rocks. And then we also use the engine to just like manually place larger, indestructible things in the world as well. For example, cliffs. Our world designer also uses Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, and this is of course for documenting or pitching and presenting direction ideas to the rest of the team. But Microsoft Word, for example, is also used for keeping track of technical limitations or rules that our world designer needs to follow in order to stay within like the performance budget. So basically the information about how many types of foliage can be on a specific tile in the world, or landscape layers per tile, or number of lights that are allowed in a certain area, and how strong they can be, whether or not they can cast shadows. Yeah, keeping track of things like that. Our world designer also uses Excel, and this is to keep track of, for example, an asset list. So like we list all the assets we have, what the status of them are. Like maybe not all of our assets are done, or maybe they're in progress, maybe they've been canceled. So they, she uses a big old document to keep track of all that stuff. Also keeps track of not just like assets, but like progress of certain areas. So for example, there's like an Excel spreadsheet of all of our caves and what's planned for the caves and the progress of individual caves and things like that. Yeah, and for like biome planning and stuff. Our world designer also uses Google Earth as just, because we have an entire planet here. And Google Earth is a great tool to use as a reference or to gain any kind of inspiration as well, and to study landscape patterns as well, so we know what we can do in our world to make it appear to be a little bit more believable. Our world designer also uses Adobe Photoshop. One of the main reasons for it is for the creation and adjustment of our pigment map. The pigment map is essentially just like a map of the world that has like colors painted over the top, and then the textures in the world at those locations can pull from that pigment map and mix the colors on the pigment map with the colors in the world. And so basically what this means is we can use the same material, for example, a certain kind of grass in one area or in two different areas, but source colors from the pigment map in different ways so that they have different tints to them, and so they appear a little bit different. So we don't have to create multiple textures for every different area. We can just mix the colors from the pigment map into the terrain, for example. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit hard to communicate, but We'll see. Okay, so the next discipline that we're going to talk about is localization. The first tool is Unreal Engine, so they're working in the engine as well. Unreal Engine has like a localization dashboard, which is a place where you can add languages that you want to support. So you can import, export text translations. It also has like a handy function to gather all the text in the entire game and put that into the localization database so that it can be translated. And then lastly, of course, Unreal Engine needs to compile all the text translation so that it can be used in the game at runtime as well. So that's what we also need to use Unreal Engine for. We also use a tool called Crowdin. Crowdin is a computer-assisted translation tool. It's kind of like an online localization platform where all of our community contributor people can go onto Crowdin, check out all the text in the game and start translating themselves. They can also use it to ask any questions or report any issues. And then from there, from Crowdin, we can download all the translations and then feed that into Unreal Engine 4. Our localization guy also uses Python. This is mostly just to create small scripts and small apps that help speed up the workflow. One great example of this is, for example, he's created some tools to help him do the text gathering and text compilation that you can do in Unreal Engine, to do that without having to launch the editor, because it can take some time for the editor to open. So he's found a way to, using Python to call that functionality from Unreal Engine without having to open the entire engine himself. So this is kind of just like a productivity boost, and uses Python for other scripts as well. For example, just creating scripts that can just help automate repetitive tasks or pull information from Crowdin so that we can, take contribution data so we can figure out who it is we want to credit in our credits section for our translations, for example, or for figuring out the percentage completion for each language that we then display in our menu in game, so people will know how complete each language translation is. Yeah, just various little things like that. Our localization guy uses Visual Studio Code, the IDE that we've mentioned before, and he uses that to write his code in Python. But he also uses Visual Studio Code just to check text files. So there might be certain ini files or config files, or the .po localization files as well. They also use Google Sheets. It uses this for various reasons, anything that would sort of benefit from being in a sheet or in a table. Things like to-do lists or lists of bugs, for example. But another great example is when building or merging term bases or like a glossary, for example. That's something that makes a lot of sense to use Google Sheets to work with. They also use Google Apps scripts in order to run certain scripts on their Google Sheets to do whatever automation they need, or merging or whatever, or to automate the gathering of information from Crowdin as well to put into spreadsheets directly. Our localization guy also uses Discord quite a bunch as well, because we do community driven localization for Satisfactory, and that's one of the reasons why we have great translation in so many different languages. And part of this is really working with the community, and so we have some extra channels for our community translators on our Discord server, and our localization manager guy talks to them a lot to make sure that we're getting everything done and that people have their questions answered and have what they need to do what they do. Now, I was told to not mention Google Translate. Don't mention Google Translate. Don't say it, but I'm gonna say it. So Google Translate is actually a tool that we sort of also do use. We don't use it for production, of course. We don't use Google Translate to get any translations into the game, but it can be used as a pretty helpful tool for like testing things or checking back translations to make sure that a translation is kind of within the ballpark of what we're talking about. Yeah, just there are some uses for Google Translate, but we never use it for production. It's a great tool, just not reliable enough for that. Next up, we have our IT department. So a lot of people have a good idea of what IT does, but in game dev, we also need an IT department. And they not only just help with general sort of sysadmin stuff to keep things running smoothly, which they do, but they do provide some help with the game and game development itself as well. The first tool that our IT department uses is PowerShell, and PowerShell is just a shell and scripting language. It's just essentially used to make handy little sysadmin tools, but also we've used it for some game stuff too. So our IT folks have created something called Speak and Spell, which is essentially just an interface for Google's text-to-speech, which we then use to create Ada's voice lines. If you didn't know, Ada from our game is actually just text-to-speech. Some people thought it was a voice actor, but no.
I can be saucy, very, very saucy.
And then, of course, we use PowerShell for other just sysadmin stuff like creating VPN connections or calendar sharing and just various other things as well. Our IT folks also use Python. As we mentioned before, Python is just a scripting language. And one example of a tool that has been made in Python is our crash collector. So if in the unfortunate event your Satisfactory has ever crashed, you will have seen a crash reporter pop up. That is something built in with Unreal Engine, but we have a crash collector tied into that so that when you do report your crashes, the crash information comes to us so we can collect it, keep it on record, analyze visualize it and just keep track of like what kind of crashes are happening. So that was a tool that was made using Python. We also use a tool called Jenkins. Jenkins is an open source automation server, which we use basically as a build system. So every time a developer submits their code to our Perforce server, our version control server, Jenkins will run and create a new build of the game each time. And what this sort of means is that when other people then get the latest version of the game, for example, artists who aren't really compiling code, what they will get is pre-compiled binaries for the editor, so they don't need to compile the code every time they get the latest. Jenkins automatically takes care of that every time a programmer checks something in. Creates some pre-compiled binaries for the editor, so no one else has to worry about that. And if for any reason it can't compile, it alerts us and lets us know that something's wrong, and then we take a look at what's up. We also use Jenkins to run profiling on new builds as well, just to check performance of the game as we go. Our IT folks also use Google Cloud Platform. So Google Cloud Platform is just something that like you can store files there, or you can run programs there, or just do others. You can do a lot of stuff with it. And our crash collector that I was mentioning before, that was made in Python, that actually runs there on the Google Cloud Platform. We also use Google Cloud Platform to store backups of our Perforce server offsite. So if anything happens to our Perforce server or to our office or anything like that, we'll have a fairly recent version of the Perforce server backed up somewhere else. The next tool that our IT folks use is called Incredibuild. And Incredibuild is essentially a program that helps distribute compile jobs amongst multiple computers across the network. And so what this means is that when someone needs to compile the game, one of the programmers makes some changes, they need to compile, what they can actually do is distribute the compile work across multiple computers within the office so that everyone can help out with the compilation of the game. Instead of just that one person's PC doing it. And so what normally could take, an hour or more only takes a few minutes with the help of everyone's PCs. Saves a lot of time. So there are actually like a lot of other tools that IT are probably using as well, and that's a rabbit hole we could go down for hours, but not all of it is necessarily relevant to like the game development side of things. But I think the main takeaway here is that our IT department is incredibly important, and they do a lot of work. They use a lot of tools, and they do a lot of work to keep operations running smoothly. So that we can just keep working on the game. Next up, we have the community management and trailer team. Folks like me. So on the community side of things, of course, we're using things like Discord and other social media. So like Discord, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, Twitch, Steam forums if you want to count Steam in this case as well. And basically we use all these tools to talk to our community, get feedback from people, and also just hang out to have fun and inform folks with as well. As for social media tools itself to help us post places, we don't actually use any tools for that. We just kind of go to the platform and do the thing. We also use Microsoft Word, for example, for scripting our scripts, such as this one. We use Adobe Premiere Pro. Adobe Premiere Pro is essentially a video editing software. You can do some more minor kind of effects in it as well. But for the most part, it's about sequencing, basically putting audio and video in order to put videos together. And of course, this video was made using Premiere Pro as well, but also our trailers are made using Premiere Pro. Adobe After Effects is also a video editing software as well, but it specializes mostly in special effects. And so we use it when needed. For example, we've got this little guy down here, this little nameplate down here. Was made in After Effects, the animation, pretty schmick, and then we use it in our videos. Some other examples are like logos in our trailers. Any animations around that are often done in After Effects and then brought into Premiere Pro to be sequenced. We use Adobe Photoshop for, the thing that comes to mind is thumbnails for YouTube videos. We use Photoshop for that, but also for any sort of like community posts or anything like that, we might use Photoshop for as well. We also use MS Paint for high quality in-game screenshots, as you can see here. Art, you're welcome. Very welcome, in fact. Yeah, just basically to create some stupid things to share with you guys. Next up, we use Audacity for recording audio. We also use Sonar for recording audio. And then we also use Adobe Audition, which we use to basically process audio. We use Shadowplay for screen capture whenever we want to take in-game footage to then, be used in a trailer, for example. We also use OBS Studio for screen capture as well. And we also use OBS Studio for live streaming. So if you haven't checked out our live streams, we stream every Tuesday at twitch.tv/CoffeeStainStudiosDevs. So check us out, give us a follow. And speaking of our streams, we also use Stream Elements for our bot commands. We use Restream as a tool that, we can stream to Restream, and then Restream will stream to multiple platforms. So we like to stream to Twitch and Steam mostly, and on special occasions we stream to YouTube as well, and Restream allows us to stream to all of those places at once. We also use Google Slides. If you have been to our streams before, you'll know that we have a segment called Community Highlights, where we highlight really cool screenshots that have been submitted by the community, and we make those slideshows using Google Slides. And then we have another tool called Stream Assistant. Yes, very good name, made by Snoot, my partner in crime, the other community manager. And this is essentially just a tool that has some nifty little functionality that we use when streaming. So again, if you've seen our streams, you'll know that we have an agenda normally at the top. This tool helps us create those tabs, switch between those tabs. It has like countdown functionality, and also the ability to save comments from chat so that we can respond to them later as well. So yeah, pretty nifty little tool that we use. Now, the last discipline that we're going to talk about here is going to be the CEO discipline. Oh boy, what tools does the CEO ask, you wonder? That's why you're all here, and it's Twitter, apparently. This guy thinks he's a meme lord. He thinks he's a comedian. He thinks he's funny. It's pretty good. It's actually pretty good, though. He's actually pretty funny. He's coming for my job, man. What am I going to do? If he keeps posting like this, what am I going to do? No, but for real, he doesn't do anything else apart from that. Anyway, that's all for today. That was a lot. I hope you found it interesting. You know, if you did find it interesting, do leave a thanks, Jace. Helps a lot in the comments below. I want to say a really big thanks to my coworkers who helped me do this. So like you saw a lot of the B-roll here. A lot of them took some time to capture the footage of the, you know, behind the scenes stuff that you guys saw. And so I appreciate them taking the time to do that. And also for talking to me and explaining to me slowly, repeatedly, in very simple English so that I could understand what it is that they're doing. And hopefully I've done a good job at conveying that to you guys as well. And so on that note, like, did I make any mistakes? I probably did. If I did, be kind, but you could let me know in the comments below. Also, if you're a game developer and you use these tools, let us know. I'd like to hear it. If you have any favorites, let us know. Yeah. Want to know what you thought of this video in general, because a lot of effort went into this and I'm really, really curious. I'm nervous, actually, but I'm curious as to what you all think of this video and if you found it interesting or helpful in any way. So if you did enjoy the video, do consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you want to keep up to date with any Satisfactory stuff, or maybe even more like just general game dev stuff, do consider subscribing as well. Thank you all very much for watching the video, taking the time to watch this entire thing. I hope you had a lovely week, and I hope you have a great weekend. Take care, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.